The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the quiet suburban streets. Cars rolled along, drivers lost in their thoughts as they made their way home from work. It was the kind of afternoon where everything felt calm, almost too calm. One particular man was just another figure on the road, driving a sleek, well-maintained car through the almost empty streets. He had a meeting earlier in the day, a long one that had him running a little behind. But now, with the meeting behind him, all he wanted was to get home and relax. The car's engine purred as he cruised down the road, windows slightly cracked to let in the evening air. His mind was focused on nothing more than getting back to his family, a quiet evening, and maybe catching up on some reading. He barely noticed the police car at first, tucked at the side of the road. But then the flash of blue lights in his rearview mirror caught his attention. He didn't panic. He wasn't the type to panic. He glanced at his speedometer and saw that he wasn't speeding. His car was in perfect condition, nothing unusual to explain a traffic stop. But as the police car drew closer, the officer's lights flashed more insistently, and he slowly pulled over to the side of the road, putting the car in park. His fingers instinctively reached for his registration and driver's license, even though he hadn't been doing anything wrong. The officer's car came to a stop behind him, and the man could feel the heat of the officer's headlights illuminating his rearview mirror. The man adjusted his seatbelt and put his hands on the steering wheel, an automatic gesture to show he wasn't a threat. He had been stopped by police before, but something about this stop felt different. The officer didn't waste time. He got out of his vehicle, and the sound of his boots against the pavement was louder than it should have been in the stillness of the street. The officer's posture was rigid, his movements sharp and deliberate. As he approached the car, the man noticed the officer's expression. There was no smile, no friendly gesture, just a sharp look like he had already made a judgment. The officer didn't greet him or ask him if everything was okay. He simply gestured for the man to roll down his window. The man complied, still wondering what this was about. "What's the problem, officer?" the man asked, his voice steady, trying to remain calm. The officer didn't answer immediately. He looked the man over with a quick, almost dismissive glance, eyes scanning the interior of the car, moving quickly from the man's face to the car's rearview mirror and then to the floor. The officer didn't seem to be looking for anything specific, but the way his eyes moved, the tension in his posture, it was clear he had already made up his mind about something. The man felt a small tightening in his chest. "I pulled you over because your taillight's out," the officer said, his voice colder than the situation seemed to warrant. The man nodded, understanding. It was a minor issue. Nothing to be upset about, nothing that couldn't be fixed. "I didn't realize," he said. "I'll take care of it as soon as I can." The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his uniform and pulled out a small notepad, scribbling something down. The man shifted in his seat, watching the officer with a quiet curiosity. He had no idea why the officer seemed so cold. He was polite, calm, and certainly not the type to get into trouble. This wasn't the first time he'd been pulled over, but it was one of the few times he'd been met with such hostility from the very start. After a moment, the officer stepped back from the car, his eyes narrowing as he stood a few feet away. He seemed to be studying the man, taking in his appearance, his black skin, the expensive watch on his wrist, the carefully pressed clothes. The officer didn't look like he was just making small talk. He was sizing him up. The man sat back in his seat, waiting. He didn't rush to speak, didn't feel the need to justify himself. But the officer's behavior was starting to feel uncomfortable. Was it just because of the taillight, or was there something else? The man couldn't quite put his finger on it. The officer returned a few moments later, this time with a different energy. He didn't smile, didn't say anything pleasant. His eyes were colder now, almost accusing. "I'm going to need your license and registration," the officer said curtly. The man reached over to the glove compartment and pulled out the papers without hesitation. He handed them to the officer, who didn't take them with any thanks. He just grabbed them with a quick motion, turning away and walking back to his squad car. The man couldn't help but notice the officer's stiff posture as he walked away, the subtle hint of suspicion in every step. A few minutes passed in silence. The man stayed seated, hands on the wheel, just waiting for the officer to return. He kept his breathing even, trying to push away the growing discomfort. He had done nothing wrong. He had no reason to be nervous, but something about the situation, the officer's demeanor, it all felt off. Was he being singled out for some reason? The man had never experienced something quite like this during a traffic stop. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the officer came back to the car, holding a clipboard in one hand. He didn't immediately speak. Instead, he stared down at the paperwork, flipping through it as though he were waiting for something to catch his eye. "Do you know why I stopped you?" the officer asked, his voice low and serious. "Yeah, the taillight," the man replied, keeping his tone neutral. The officer nodded but didn't seem satisfied with the answer. Instead, his eyes locked onto the man's face, his gaze sharp. The man held his gaze without flinching. "I don't think it's just the taillight," the officer said, his voice carrying an edge now. "There's something about you." "I don't know. You don't look like you belong here." The man's brow furrowed in confusion. The officer's words were strange, cryptic, and now that uncomfortable feeling began to grow even stronger. The man wasn't about to let the officer's vague insinuations slide. "What do you mean by that?" the man asked, his voice firm but still composed. The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took another long look at the man, almost sizing him up as if he were trying to figure something out. The man knew what the officer was thinking. The officer had made an assumption based solely on his appearance. He was making judgments about him without even knowing anything about who he was or what he did. It was a sad reality, but it was one the man had dealt with time and time again. The officer's gaze lingered longer than necessary. There was an unsettling air about him, something that made the man's stomach tighten with an uneasy feeling. The officer stood there, his posture stiff, his hands resting on his belt as if he were waiting for something. The man could sense the tension in the officer's presence, an air of suspicion that hadn't been there before. The man didn't let the officer's silence rattle him. He'd been through situations like this before. The officer wasn't just questioning him about a taillight anymore. This was something deeper. The man had grown accustomed to being treated differently, to the quiet judgments that others made when they saw him. It wasn't the first time he'd felt the weight of someone's assumptions. And it probably wouldn't be the last. He kept his hands on the steering wheel, trying his best to stay calm. His fingers tightened slightly around the wheel, but he made sure his voice stayed steady when he spoke. "I don't think I understand what you mean," the man said, his tone even, but with a slight edge of confusion. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer's eyes narrowed. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but then hesitated. The moment dragged on in silence, the sound of the man's breathing filling the quiet cabin of the car. The officer was clearly trying to figure out what to say next, as if he were processing something. "You don't belong here," the officer repeated, his voice barely above a whisper, as though he were still trying to convince himself. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" The words hung in the air like a weight that the man could feel pressing down on his chest. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. It wasn't just the taillight. The officer wasn't concerned with a minor infraction anymore. He was making assumptions about the man's presence, about where he belonged. His tone, though calm, was heavy with judgment, and the man could feel the sharp edge of it cutting through the air between them. The officer wasn't looking at the man like a regular driver. He was looking at him like an outsider, a person who didn't fit in, and for a moment the man's mind raced. Should he speak up? Should he confront the officer? He had the right to remain calm and composed, but in situations like this there were always risks involved. The officer could escalate things at any moment, especially with the way things were unfolding. The man cleared his throat and took a deep breath before responding. "I live here," he said, keeping his voice neutral but with a firmness that he hoped would cut through the officer's assumptions. "I'm just driving home from a meeting." "I've done nothing wrong." The officer stared at him, still not fully convinced. The man could see the skepticism written across his face. It was as if he was still trying to figure out the man's story, as if he didn't believe it. The officer's eyes darted from the man to the car and then back to him, like he was weighing something in his mind. The man felt the weight of that look, the silent judgment, and for a moment it felt like time had stopped. "I'm going to need you to step out of the car," the officer said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was still calm, but there was an authority behind it now. The man's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop anymore. This was something else, something more dangerous. The man didn't immediately react. Instead, he looked the officer in the eye. He could feel his pulse quicken, but he kept his composure. He knew that if he let fear take over, it could spiral into something much worse. He had to stay in control, just as he had done so many times before in situations like this. "I haven't done anything wrong," the man said again, his voice steady, but more insistent. "I'm not getting out of the car unless you tell me why." The officer took a step closer, his boots scraping against the pavement. There was no kindness in his eyes now. He was close enough for the man to see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers twitched near his holster. The officer had clearly made up his mind, and the man knew deep down that this wasn't about the taillight anymore. It wasn't about the car or the small traffic infraction. It was about something deeper, something the officer was unwilling to admit. The officer didn't say anything at first. He stood there, his eyes locked onto the man's as though trying to gauge whether or not the man would comply. The minutes felt like hours, and the man could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew that every move had to be calculated. Finally, the officer spoke again, his voice low and firm. "I'm asking you to step out of the vehicle. If you refuse, I'll have to take further action." The man's heart rate picked up a notch, but he didn't let the officer's threat sway him. He was used to these moments, the moments where everything felt uncertain, where he had to decide whether to back down or stand his ground. He wasn't about to make this easier for the officer, especially when he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. "I'm not stepping out until you tell me why," the man said again, his voice unwavering. He had no idea where this was going, but he wasn't about to let the officer control the situation. The officer's lips tightened into a thin line. He stood there for a long moment, his hands hovering near his belt. The tension between them was palpable. Finally, the officer sighed, clearly frustrated, and backed away from the car. He turned and walked back to his squad car, muttering something under his breath. The man sat there, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm his nerves. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but he knew that the situation had escalated far beyond what it should have been. It wasn't just a routine stop anymore, it was personal. The officer had already made his assumptions, and now it seemed like he was looking for any excuse to escalate things further. The officer returned to the car after what felt like an eternity. He didn't say anything at first, just handed the man a ticket for the broken taillight without so much as a word of apology. The man took the ticket not because he was guilty, but because he knew it was easier than arguing with a man who had already made up his mind about him. As the officer turned to leave, the man felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, frustration, and a sense of defeat washed over him. The officer's behavior hadn't just been rude, it had been dehumanizing. He had been treated like a criminal simply because of the way he looked, simply because he didn't fit into the officer's narrow view of who should belong in this neighborhood. The officer climbed back into his squad car and drove off, the blue lights fading into the distance. The man sat in his car for a long moment, staring out at the empty road. His heart was still racing, but it wasn't from fear anymore, it was from anger. He had been humiliated for no reason, and while he knew that he could have handled the situation differently, he also knew that it wasn't about the way he handled it. It was about the way he had been treated from the very beginning. With a deep breath, the man started his car and pulled back onto the road. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The officer was gone, but the weight of what had just happened lingered. He wasn't sure what he was going to do next, but one thing was clear. This wouldn't be the last time he'd be forced to confront people's assumptions about him. But for now, all he wanted was to get home, to be with his family, to forget about the traffic stop and the way it had made him feel. But deep down, he knew he wouldn't forget. Not anytime soon. The man drove slowly, his hand still gripping the steering wheel with a tightness that reflected the tension in his chest. The road ahead seemed endless, the lights of the city flickering in the distance, but none of it felt right. It was just another ordinary evening, but now nothing felt ordinary anymore. He had been through hundreds of traffic stops, but none of them had felt like this. None of them had left him feeling so exposed. His thoughts raced, the moments from the stop replaying over and over in his head. The officer's dismissive tone, the way the man's simple presence had seemed to trigger such animosity in the officer. He had done nothing wrong, and yet, from the moment the officer approached his car, it had been like the man was already guilty of something. Something that didn't even exist. He thought about what had happened next, the officer's sudden demand that he step out of the car. It had shaken him, though he hadn't shown it. He had been calm on the outside, but inside his mind had been working at full speed, weighing his options, calculating the best way to handle the situation. He had known, deep down, that this wasn't just about a broken taillight anymore. It was about something bigger, something more personal. His grip on the steering wheel tightened again as his thoughts circled back to the moment when the officer had first made that comment. "You don't belong here." The words had stung, even though the officer had barely said them above a whisper. There was a rawness to them, a bitterness that the man had felt deep in his bones. It wasn't the first time he'd been made to feel like an outsider, but somehow this time it had hit harder. Maybe it was the way the officer had sized him up, the way he had looked at him like he didn't fit, like he wasn't supposed to be in that neighborhood. The man's thoughts were interrupted when he saw the familiar street signs ahead. His neighborhood. It should have been a relief, but all it did was remind him of the uncomfortable encounter. He turned onto his street, the familiar sights of his neighborhood doing little to ease the tightness in his chest. As he drove past the rows of houses, he couldn't help but feel like he was still carrying the weight of the officer's judgment with him. It was like an invisible burden that had been placed on his shoulders, one that he couldn't shake off so easily. He parked his car in the driveway and sat there for a moment, his hands still on the wheel, staring at the house in front of him. Inside, his family was waiting. His children, his partner. He could hear their laughter in his mind, their voices full of life and love. That was the reason he had been on his way home. But now, after everything that had happened, it was hard to imagine going inside and pretending like nothing was wrong. Finally, with a deep breath, he opened the door and stepped out of the car. The cool evening air hit his face, and for a moment it cleared his mind. He walked slowly up the driveway, trying to shake off the lingering tension from the stop. He was home. He was safe, but something inside him still felt unsettled. Inside the house, his partner was in the kitchen finishing up dinner. The sound of pots and pans clanging together, the smell of food filling the air. It was all so normal, so comforting. It should have been a welcome distraction, but the man found it hard to relax. The conversation from earlier kept playing in his mind, his thoughts still caught on the way the officer had treated him. "Hey," his partner said, glancing up from the stove as he walked into the kitchen. "How was your meeting?" "Fine," the man replied, his voice flat. He wasn't ready to talk about the stop yet. He didn't want to bring it up, didn't want to ruin the evening. But the unease inside him was too strong to ignore. He could feel it in his chest like a dull ache that wouldn't go away. "Everything okay?" his partner asked, sensing the change in his demeanor. "You seem off." The man sighed and leaned against the counter, rubbing his forehead. He didn't know how to explain it. How could he? How could he explain the feeling of being judged, of being looked at like you were guilty of something when you weren't? How could he put into words the frustration of having someone assume the worst of you, just because of the color of your skin? "I got pulled over," he said finally, his voice quiet. "For a broken taillight." His partner raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "That's it? Just a taillight?" The man nodded, his hand still pressed against his forehead. "Yeah, but it wasn't about the taillight. The officer, he didn't care about that." "Then what happened?" The man paused, trying to find the right words. "He started asking me all these questions as if I didn't belong there. As if I didn't have the right to be in that neighborhood. It was like he had already decided something about me before I even opened my mouth." His partner looked at him, silent for a moment, as if processing what he had just heard. "That sounds terrible," they said softly. "Did he do anything else?" "Yeah," the man continued. "He asked me to step out of the car like I was some kind of criminal. Like he didn't believe me when I said I lived here, that I was just coming home from a meeting. I don't know, it didn't feel right. It felt personal, and I don't know why, but I couldn't shake it. I still can't." His partner stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that. It's not fair." The man exhaled slowly, trying to push down the frustration that was rising within him. "I know, but it's not the first time this has happened. It's just hard to deal with it when it happens. You know?" "I know," his partner replied, giving his arm a gentle squeeze. "I get it. It's not right. And I'm glad you're home safe. That's what matters." For a moment, the man stood there, letting the comfort of his partner's words wash over him. It helped, it always did. But there was still a gnawing feeling in the back of his mind. He knew that the officer's actions weren't just an isolated incident. They were a reflection of something much bigger, a symptom of the world he lived in, a world where people like him were too often judged before they were even given a chance to prove themselves. The man shook his head, trying to clear his mind. "I'll be fine, it's hard sometimes, you know." "I know," his partner said again, pulling him into a hug. "But you don't have to carry it alone. We're in this together." The warmth of the embrace was comforting, grounding him in the moment. He knew he couldn't change the officer's actions, but he could control how he reacted to them. He could choose to rise above it. He could choose to move forward, even when it felt like the world was working against him. He held on to that thought as he pulled away from the hug, offering a small smile. "Thanks," he said softly. "Anytime," his partner replied, returning the smile. "Now let's eat. You look like you could use something good." The man nodded, grateful for the comfort of home, for the familiarity of his partner's presence. He sat down at the table, pushing the events of the stop to the back of his mind, at least for now. There would be time to process it later. But for now, he was home, and that was enough. As they sat down to eat, the man found some peace in the simple act of being together. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that, despite everything, there were still things in this world worth holding on to, and as long as he had that, he could face whatever came next. The next few days passed in a blur. Life went on as it always did, and the man did his best to push the traffic stop to the back of his mind. But the encounter stayed with him, lingering like an unwanted shadow. He couldn't escape the feeling that something had changed. He had been treated like an outsider for something he couldn't control, something as basic as the color of his skin. And it was hard to let that go. Every time he left his house, there was a part of him that felt a little more cautious, a little more aware of his surroundings. He tried not to show it, not to let it affect the way he carried himself, but it was there, simmering just beneath the surface. The incident with the officer had taken something from him, a small piece of his peace, of his sense of security. But the man was used to pushing through. He had learned to live with discomfort, to carry it without letting it weigh him down completely. He had a family to take care of, a life to live. So each day he went about his business as usual, determined not to let the incident define him. On the fourth day after the stop, as he was driving home from a meeting, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. A police car parked on the side of the road, its lights flashing. He didn't know why, but the sight of it triggered something deep inside him. It wasn't just the officer's presence, it was the memory of what had happened. The flash of blue lights in his rearview mirror, the way everything had felt so wrong. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. His pulse quickened. He tried to calm himself, to remind himself that this was just another routine traffic stop. But he couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. As he drove past the police car, he stole a quick glance at the officer sitting inside. The officer didn't look up. The man kept his eyes on the road, trying to push the anxiety away. It wasn't the officer's fault, but it didn't stop the feeling from creeping back in. He told himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him, that he was overreacting. But the truth was he had been changed by the experience. He made it home without incident, but the unease lingered. That night, as he lay in bed beside his partner, sleep didn't come easily. His mind kept replaying the traffic stop over and over. The officer's harsh words, his assumptions, the way the encounter had unfolded, it all felt so personal. He knew that he had done nothing wrong, that the officer had no right to treat him the way he had. But the reality was that it had happened, and he couldn't undo it. The next morning, he found himself standing at the kitchen counter, staring out the window, lost in thought. He had to do something. He couldn't just let the situation slide, not after what had happened. But what could he do? He wasn't sure where to start. The officer was just doing his job, right? But wasn't that part of the problem? That the officer had assumed so much about him simply because of the way he looked? As the man mulled over his options, his phone rang. It was a call he had been expecting but not quite prepared for. The caller ID showed a local number, one he didn't recognize. "Hello?" he answered. "Is this name?" a deep voice asked. "Yes, this is him," the man replied, his curiosity piqued. "This is Officer Daniels from the police department. I'm calling to follow up on an incident that occurred a few days ago." I believe you were involved in a traffic stop with one of our officers, Officer Garcia. The man's heart skipped a beat. The officer's name. The same officer who had pulled him over, who had treated him with such disdain. He had expected this call, but hearing it made the whole situation feel real again. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. Yes, I remember the stop, the man said, keeping his tone steady. I'm assuming you're calling to apologize? There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Not exactly, Officer Daniels said carefully. I'm calling because Officer Garcia has raised some concerns about your behavior during the stop. He's reported that you were uncooperative and refused to comply with his orders. The man's grip tightened on the phone. The words hit him like a slap in the face. He had been nothing but calm and cooperative during the stop. The officer, on the other hand, had been the one who had escalated the situation. And now to hear that Officer Garcia was twisting the narrative to make himself look like the victim, it felt like a betrayal. I'm sorry, officer, the man said, his voice tight with frustration. But that's not how it went down. I was polite and calm the entire time. I didn't refuse to cooperate. I simply asked why I was being treated like that. And I'm not going to apologize for standing up for myself. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I understand your frustration, sir. I truly do, Officer Daniels said. But I have to look into what happened from both sides. I'm just doing my job. If you'd like to file a formal complaint, I can arrange that for you. But in the meantime, I need to ask you to come in for a statement. The man's mind raced. A statement? What was this all about? He didn't want to get caught up in some back and forth with the department. He didn't want to drag this out. But at the same time, he knew he couldn't just let the officer's false narrative stand. He had been wronged, and it was time to make sure his side of the story was heard. I'll come in, the man said after a beat. But I'm not going to let this go. I'm not going to let you or anyone else sweep this under the rug. Of course, sir, Officer Daniels replied. I'll have the paperwork ready for you. We'll get this sorted out. The man hung up the phone, a mix of anger and determination flooding his chest. He wasn't sure what would come of the meeting, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let the officer get away with what had happened. He wasn't going to let his dignity be trampled over. The next morning, he found himself at the police station, sitting in a small, sterile room, waiting for Officer Daniels to arrive. He was nervous, but also resolute. This was the right thing to do. He had to make sure that what had happened didn't go unaddressed. He had to make sure that no one else would be treated the way he had been treated. When Officer Daniels walked into the room, the man stood up and extended his hand. The officer shook it, but there was an awkwardness in the air. It was clear that neither of them was entirely comfortable with the situation. I just want to make sure we're clear on what happened, the man said as they sat down. I was pulled over for a broken taillight and I cooperated the entire time. But Officer Garcia didn't treat me like a person. He treated me like I was guilty of something, just because of how I looked. He never asked me any questions about who I was or what I was doing. He just assumed. And that's not right. Officer Daniels listened quietly, his face unreadable. I understand, he said slowly. I'll look into this further and I'll make sure your side of the story is heard. I want to make sure everything is handled fairly. The man didn't trust the words, not completely, but he knew this was the right step. He wasn't going to let it slide. And as he left the police station later that day, there was a sense of resolve within him. The road ahead was uncertain, but he was prepared to walk it. He would make sure that this story didn't just belong to the officer. It belonged to him too. And no matter what happened next, he would make sure his voice was heard. The days following his meeting at the police station were tense. The man wasn't sure what he had expected, but the silence that followed his formal complaint was louder than anything else. He had been told that Officer Daniels would look into the incident, but each day that passed without any word only added to the uncertainty gnawing at him. He couldn't help but wonder if his complaint would be brushed aside, if it would be dismissed as just another case of a routine traffic stop gone wrong. The system was flawed, he knew that much, but still he hoped for something different, something better. He had hoped that speaking up would make a difference. He had hoped that by standing his ground, by taking the necessary steps to ensure his voice was heard, he could at least force some kind of change. But with each passing day, that hope began to feel like a distant memory. It was hard to shake the feeling that nothing would come of it, that the officer would face no consequences for his actions. But he couldn't stop now. Not after everything he had gone through. He had to keep pushing. For himself. For others who didn't have the chance to speak up. He knew he couldn't change everything, but maybe he could change something. If he could get the truth out there, if he could make the system take notice, maybe, just maybe, things would improve. One morning, a week after he had filed the complaint, the phone rang. He had been expecting it, but the suddenness of it still caught him off guard. He reached for the phone, his heart racing in his chest as he picked it up. "Hello?" he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "This is Officer Daniels," the voice on the other end said. "I wanted to speak with you about the incident involving Officer Garcia. We've completed our investigation and I have some updates for you." The man's heart skipped a beat. It had only been a week, but he had already convinced himself that the investigation would lead nowhere. He hadn't heard anything, so he had assumed that they would just let it slide. The fact that Officer Daniels was calling meant that something had changed. But what? "Okay," the man said, trying to keep his voice calm. "What's the update?" There was a brief pause before Officer Daniels spoke again, his tone more serious now. "After looking into the incident and speaking with both you and Officer Garcia, we've decided to take action. Officer Garcia has been reprimanded for his behavior during the stop. He's received a formal warning and will undergo additional training to address his conduct." The man's mind raced as he processed the words. A reprimand. A warning. That was it? It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. He had expected more. He had hoped for more. But a reprimand? That felt like a slap on the wrist. A way for the department to say that they had done something without actually holding the officer accountable. He wasn't satisfied, not by a long shot. "I appreciate that you've looked into it," the man said, his voice quiet but firm. "But I don't think that's enough. What happened to me wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't just poor judgment. It was a reflection of how some officers treat people who don't look like them. It's a bigger issue, and I don't think a warning is going to fix it." There was a silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, the man wondered if Officer Daniels would push back, but instead he spoke again, his voice tinged with something that sounded like understanding. "I hear what you're saying," Officer Daniels replied, "and I agree that there's a bigger issue at play here. But unfortunately, we can only address what happened during the traffic stop itself. We can't make changes to the entire system overnight. But I can assure you that Officer Garcia's behavior is being taken seriously, and we'll be monitoring his future conduct." The man's frustration was building again, but he kept his voice steady. "I understand that. But it's not just about one officer. It's about how this kind of behavior is allowed to happen in the first place, how it's tolerated, how it's normalized. I know that one investigation isn't going to fix everything, but I had to speak up. And I'm not going to stop. Not now. Not ever." There was a pause before Officer Daniels spoke again, his tone more thoughtful. "I respect that," he said. "I'm glad you spoke up. It's not easy to challenge the system, especially when it feels like nothing will change. But you've made a difference. You've brought attention to an issue that needs to be addressed, and that's something." The man took a deep breath, trying to collect his thoughts. He didn't feel better, but he did feel a sense of resolve. The system might be flawed, and it might take a long time to make meaningful change, but that didn't mean he should give up. His voice mattered. His actions mattered. "I hope so," the man said quietly. "I hope it does make a difference. For me and for others who've gone through the same thing. I'll make sure we keep an eye on things," Officer Daniels said. "And if anything else comes up, don't hesitate to reach out." "Thank you," the man replied, though the words felt hollow. He didn't know if anything would change, but he was done waiting for someone else to make that decision for him. He would continue to speak out, continue to stand up for what was right, even if it felt like an uphill battle. After hanging up the phone, the man sat in silence for a long while. The weight of the conversation settled in. Officer Garcia's reprimand felt insufficient, but it was a step, however small, in the right direction. The system might not be ready to change, but he could keep pushing, keep trying to make a difference. His thoughts drifted back to the officer's words during the stop. The way he had looked at him, the way he had assumed so much about him without even knowing his story. It wasn't just about one officer. It was about an entire culture, a system that perpetuated these assumptions. And it wasn't just something that affected him. It affected countless others who were treated the same way, who had their lives impacted by the same biases and prejudices. But he couldn't change everything overnight. He couldn't solve the problem on his own. What he could do was keep speaking out, keep sharing his story. He could keep raising awareness, even if it meant facing more obstacles along the way. That night, as he sat with his family, the conversation with Officer Daniels still fresh in his mind, the man realized something important. Change didn't always come quickly. Sometimes it came in small incremental steps. It came through people who refused to stay silent, who kept pushing for what was right, even when the odds seemed stacked against them, and no matter how small the change was, it was still progress. It was still something, and as long as he had the strength to keep fighting, he would continue to push for that change. The journey was far from over. But for the first time in a while, the man felt like he was moving in the right direction. He wasn't sure where the road would lead, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to stop. The weeks passed by, each one feeling both slow and fast at the same time. The man had returned to his usual routine: work, home, time with his family. But the events of the past month lingered in his thoughts. The traffic stop, the officer's treatment, and the aftermath of his complaint had changed something within him. It was more than just frustration. It was a sense of awakening. He had never imagined that something so small, so seemingly insignificant, could have such a lasting impact on his life. At first, he had hoped that filing the complaint would be enough, that the system would correct itself, that the officer would be held accountable. But now, as time passed, he realized that change wasn't going to come quickly. It wouldn't happen overnight, and it certainly wouldn't happen because of one complaint. But that didn't mean he should give up. He spent nights lying awake, thinking about what he could do next. How could he push for change in a system that felt so set in its ways? What could he do that would make a real difference? He had no answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let the past month be in vain. He couldn't let the officer's actions go unchallenged. The world might not change in the blink of an eye, but he could at least try to push it in the right direction. One evening, while sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, he finally decided to do something more. He would start by sharing his story, not just to his family or his close circle, but to the wider community. He wanted to raise awareness, to show that this kind of behavior wasn't an isolated incident. He had heard enough stories from friends and strangers alike, people who had faced the same treatment, the same assumptions, just because of the color of their skin. It was time to speak up, to let others know that they weren't alone. The man opened his laptop and began typing. It wasn't easy. How do you write about something so personal, something that had left him feeling so small and powerless? But he knew that if he could just get the words down, if he could share his experience, maybe it would make a difference. Maybe it would be the start of something bigger. He typed slowly at first, unsure of where to begin. But as he wrote, the words started to flow. He talked about the traffic stop, the officer's assumptions, his dismissive attitude, the way he had been treated like a criminal without cause. He talked about the frustration, the anger, and the hurt that had followed. But he also talked about the determination he felt, the decision he had made to speak up, to file the complaint, to do something. When he finished, he sat back and read through it. It was raw. It was honest. It was his truth. He didn't know what would come of it, but he hit send, posting the story online. He wasn't sure who would read it, or if anyone would even care. But he knew that he had done something important. He had shared his voice, and in doing so, he had taken another step toward making a difference. The response wasn't immediate. For the first few days, he didn't hear much. A few likes, a few comments of support from people he knew, but nothing overwhelming. It felt like his words had disappeared into the void, lost among the noise of the internet. But then slowly things started to change. More people began to share his post. More people started commenting, telling their own stories of similar experiences. The post began to pick up momentum, spreading beyond his circle of friends and family. People from all over the country began to reach out, offering their support, sharing their own encounters with unfair treatment. It was eye-opening, humbling, and at times overwhelming. He hadn't realized how many people had experienced what he had, how many people had been treated unfairly, not because of what they had done, but because of who they were. It wasn't just strangers who reached out. His phone began to buzz with messages from old friends, colleagues, and even acquaintances. People he hadn't spoken to in years were sending their support, telling him that they had read his story and that they admired his courage. Some told him they had been through similar situations. Others said that his story had opened their eyes to something they hadn't fully understood before. For the first time in a long while, the man felt like he wasn't alone. His voice was being heard. And more than that, he was beginning to see that his story wasn't just his own. It was the story of so many others. People who had been silenced or ignored for far too long. It was a story that needed to be told, not just once, but over and over again until things began to change. But even as the messages of support poured in, the man knew that this was just the beginning. The response was encouraging, but it didn't change the fact that systemic issues were still deeply rooted in society. It didn't change the fact that the officer who had treated him so badly had only received a reprimand. It didn't change the fact that for many people, speaking up meant risking something, a job, a reputation, even safety. Change wouldn't come just from one post. It would take time, effort, and most of all, persistence. As he sat there reading the messages of support, the man realized that this was the next step in his journey. It wasn't about one complaint or one post. It was about using his voice to create a ripple effect. It was about raising awareness, about showing others that they didn't have to stand in silence, that their voices mattered too. The next day, he received an unexpected call. It was from a local news station, asking if he would be willing to share his story on air. At first, he was hesitant. He wasn't a public figure, and the thought of being on TV made him nervous. But after everything that had happened, after seeing the impact his story had already made, he knew that he couldn't turn down the opportunity. This was bigger than him now. It was about something greater. A few days later, he found himself sitting in front of a camera, sharing his story with a much larger audience. The reporter asked him questions about the traffic stop, about how it had made him feel, about why he had chosen to speak out. As he spoke, he could feel the weight of it all, the responsibility of telling the truth, of being a voice for those who had been silenced. It was daunting, but it was also empowering. He wasn't just sharing his own experience anymore. He was giving a platform to the countless others who had felt the same way. The interview aired that evening, and once again the response was overwhelming. People reached out from all over, thanking him for his courage, for speaking out when so many others had stayed silent. It felt like the start of something important, something that could, over time, lead to change. The man didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in weeks he felt a sense of hope. It was small, but it was real. He had taken a step forward, and in doing so, he had opened a door that others could walk through too. The journey wasn't over, far from it, but it had started, and that was the most important thing. That night, as he sat down with his family to dinner, he smiled. They had been with him through it all, through the frustrations, the fears, the doubts, and now they were seeing the impact of his decision to speak up. They were seeing that his voice mattered, that their support mattered, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, the man's life slowly began to change. What had started as a single act of speaking out had gained momentum, becoming something much bigger than he had ever imagined. His story had sparked a conversation, one that reached far beyond his own experience. It was a conversation about fairness, equality, and the power of speaking up. He had never intended for his post or his interview on TV to lead to anything so big. But now, as he sat at his kitchen table one evening, reading through the flood of messages and comments, he realized that his story had ignited something. People were talking, and not just about the traffic stop. They were talking about the deeper issues at play, about the biases that still shaped the way people were treated, about how systemic racism wasn't something that could be ignored. The phone rang again, and this time, it was from a community organizer he had met through a mutual friend. They had seen his post, and they wanted to talk about how he could get involved in efforts to bring more awareness to the issues of racial profiling and police accountability. At first, he wasn't sure. He wasn't an activist. He wasn't someone who had ever set out to be a leader. But as the days passed and he thought more about it, he realized that this was an opportunity. It was an opportunity to not just talk about change, but to help make it happen. Over the next few weeks, he began to attend community meetings, meet with others who were passionate about reform, and learn more about the issues that were still plaguing the system. It wasn't easy. It was uncomfortable at times, especially when he had to confront his own biases and assumptions. But he knew that if he wanted to be part of the change, he had to be willing to do the work. It wasn't enough to just speak out. He had to be willing to listen, to learn, and to act. There were days when it felt overwhelming. When the stories of others, stories of people who had faced the same discrimination, the same hurt, took a toll on him. There were days when he wanted to give up, when he felt like he was just one person, one voice in a sea of many. But he kept going, because he knew that if everyone thought that way, nothing would ever change. If everyone waited for someone else to take action, nothing would get better. So he kept showing up, kept speaking out, kept pushing for something different. One evening, as he sat with his family, discussing the latest meeting he had attended, his partner looked at him with a mixture of pride and concern. "You're doing great work," they said. "But how are you holding up? I can see how much it's affecting you." The man paused for a moment, looking at his family. They had been his rock through everything. They had supported him when he decided to speak up about the traffic stop, when he had shared his story with the world, and when he had started getting involved in the movement for change. But now they were concerned about him, and he understood why. The work was heavy. The stories he was hearing were heartbreaking. The weight of it all was starting to take a toll on him. "I'm okay," he said, offering a reassuring smile. "It's just a lot sometimes, but I can't stop. I can't give up now." His partner nodded, their eyes full of understanding. "I know, and I'm proud of you for everything you're doing. But don't forget about yourself in the process. You can't help others if you're not taking care of yourself." He knew they were right. He couldn't keep pushing without making time for himself. The fight for justice was important, but so was his well-being. It wasn't always easy to find the balance, but he promised himself that he would try. A few days later, he received a message from Officer Daniels. It was a simple text, just a few words. "We're reopening your case. We'll be in touch." The man's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this. After everything that had happened, after the reprimand that Officer Garcia had received, he had assumed that was the end of it. But now it seemed like the department was finally taking things more seriously. He wasn't sure what would come of it, but the fact that they were reopening the case was something. The following week, he sat down for another meeting with Officer Daniels. This time it wasn't just about his own experience, it was about a larger conversation. Officer Daniels was no longer just an officer. He was part of the conversation. He was someone who was willing to listen, to understand, and to work toward finding solutions. "I know this won't fix everything," Officer Daniels said, his voice calm but serious. "But I want to make sure we're doing everything we can to make this right. We've reviewed the body cam footage from the stop and we're taking further action." The man listened, his emotions a mix of hope and skepticism. He had heard promises before, and he knew that words didn't always translate into action. But the fact that they were willing to review the footage, to look at the situation more closely, it felt like progress. "We're going to retrain Officer Garcia," Officer Daniels continued, "and we're going to make sure this doesn't happen again." It wasn't everything. It wasn't a complete fix, but it was a step in the right direction. The man had no illusions. He knew that this wasn't going to solve all the problems, but it was something. It was accountability and it was change, however small, and sometimes that's all you could ask for. As he left the station that day, the man felt a sense of resolve. He wasn't done. The fight wasn't over. But this was a victory, even if it was small, and it was one he wasn't going to take for granted. The next few months brought more victories, more setbacks, and more challenges. There were times when the road felt long and the obstacles seemed insurmountable. But the man kept going. He kept fighting. He kept speaking out. And slowly he began to see the change he had been hoping for. More people began to speak up. More people began to share their stories. More people began to stand up for what was right. It wasn't happening all at once, but it was happening, and that was enough. As he sat at the kitchen table one evening, looking at the messages and letters of support that had piled up over the months, the man felt a quiet pride. His voice had made a difference. His story had sparked something, and while the journey wasn't over, it had started, and for the first time in a long time he felt hopeful. Hopeful that change was possible. Hopeful that the world could be better. Hopeful that together they could make it so.